Thank you very much. After that really wonderful session, I think that my panelists will be an excellent sounding board, I think, to extend that discussion. And we're going to take this discussion to China's global business and financial infrastructure. What role does China's global investment in financial technologies play in U.S. China technological competition? This is a very important question. My name is Shirley Lin. I'm at the Miller Center. I spent half of my year in Asia, living in both Hong Kong and Taiwan. And this is my home here in Charlottesville. It's great to be back talking about such an important topic with three very, very excellent panelists who have actually written about similar topics at the same time with very different opinions. So the way our panel will work is I'm going to direct a question at each of them on what they actually have been written about the most. But at the same time, they're all capable of answering several other questions that were already raised in the first panel that I think you would like to dig deeper on. So let me start with introducing Martin Trozempa. He's a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and he's the author of The Cashless Revolution, China's Reinvention of Money, 2022. I think based on that, you can imagine he is very capable of addressing the prospect of financial reengineering, if you will, by China in trying to place China and its currency at the center of the world. Financial services and infrastructure restructuring while retaining tight capital control over the renminbi. This is an incredibly difficult and ambitious task. How has it been in terms of China's ability to expand its financial architecture abroad? And how has technology been a critical part of this? Furthermore, China, of course, in the recent two sessions, as we call it, the National Party Congress and the National Policy Advisory Body meeting, basically came out with two very important directives. The institution of National Financial Regulatory Administration and National Data Bureau means that there's more control over data and finance, which you've written a lot about. So Martin, why don't we start with you?
Sure, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'll start with a discussion of what the financial infrastructure of the world looks like today, then go a bit into how technology has changed the way finance is done in China, and then conclude with a little bit of discussion about how much that's likely or not to change what I mentioned at the beginning, the U.S. dominance. So today, global financial infrastructure is largely centered around the U.S. dollar and U.S. financial institutions. Despite all of China's rise, despite the Belt and Road, some of you might be surprised to know that most of the loans that the Belt and Road initiative from China have issued are actually in U.S. dollars and of getting paid in dollars, not in renminbi to somewhere else. The U.S. dollar is involved in 88% of global foreign exchange transactions. The renminbi is something like 2% of global reserves. The U.S. is something like 50% of global reserves. You see, the renminbi is not really much of a heavyweight. And when China and Korea trade with each other, for example, most of that is likely to go through the U.S. dollar, and the money is going to end up being moved in New York. Which is surprising because the U.S. is not a party to that transaction at all. But it's just so efficient, so liquid, so dependable, until we default on the debt ceiling, at least, to use the U.S. dollar, that it ends up being the center. Then if we look at China itself domestically, we find what I wrote my book about, which is that a group of technology companies, mainly Alibaba and Tencent, together completely remade the way that finance is done in China. It was sclerotic, state-controlled, repressive, with limited choice, very limited innovation. And then in the period of a couple of years, suddenly the entire financial system, at least the way that people interact with it, has been remade around these big super apps and that are so advanced that it makes people in Silicon Valley, like Mark Zuckerberg, as for example, said he wished he would have looked at WeChat earlier and designed Facebook products around it. The idea for Libra to create a global super app centered around Facebook was largely inspired by what WeChat had already achieved in China. And so it would naturally stand to reason that something that's so innovative and successful in China would then begin to spread abroad. And what we found actually in my work is that it hasn't happened that way. And why is really curious. One reason is that China is a protected market. So the companies that have been successful there are successful in that specific ecosystem. They've kind of evolved too much to be like China. And then when they go abroad to places like India, they discover that actually the super app model doesn't work in the same way as it does elsewhere. And there are also geopolitical concerns. So Ant Group, the largest financial technology company in China, tried to buy MoneyGram, which is a major money transfer provider all around the world, and is also used to a great extent by the U.S. military. With service members try to transfer money back home. And the U.S. CFIUS, which screens for investments in the U.S. for national security concerns, said, no way, and blocked this. And even it's not just the U.S. Countries like Indonesia, for example, have said, you're fine to use these Chinese super apps to serve Chinese tourists, to sell them things. But we're not okay with these companies gathering data, sensitive financial data, linking to the previous session, on our citizens. But they're actually fine with them using Visa cards and MasterCards. So we see this really interesting dichotomy where US financial giants that are established everywhere and US social media companies like Facebook, which owns WhatsApp, have largely run the table with the global social media outside of TikTok and financial side. And that has not been disrupted whatsoever by the Chinese model. The question, so they've been successful in getting dozens of countries to say, accept, I can go to a CVS in DuPont Circle and pay with Alipay, but I'm a really weird person because I have Alipay. Almost no Americans have it. They have been completely unsuccessful at getting foreign users of their services. The question now is central bank digital currency going to change all of this? So the private companies haven't been able to do it, but maybe the Central Bank of China, which is the world's most advanced major economy in central bank digital currency, will create some new financial infrastructure that is so great in blockchain, integrated, and it's going to dethrone the US dollar. I have been super bearish on this idea since before it was fashionable, and testified the US shouldn't really worried about it. And the main reason is that in tech, I think we often see a second mover rather than a first mover advantage. So if you think about social media, who is the first really successful social media company? It's like MySpace. How are they doing today? How about the first web browser? Who uses Netscape? Okay, we have one person. How many people use Google Wallet, for example, compared to, So what we find is that often the first mover kind of runs into a lot of problems, and the second mover can learn from it and actually be more successful. And this is what I think will happen in central bank digital currency. China is this leader. It's invested a huge amount of effort. Hundreds of millions of people in China have tried using their central bank digital currency. And but they've used it. Once they use it once, they stop using it. And so I really don't think that the advantages of the US dollar about technology at this point, what we're seeing, is it's actually due to these extremely strong network effects and trust that people just don't have in the renminbi and don't have in Chinese technology companies. But I always say we can't be super complacent as the United States and just think, oh, we have these great advantages. But instead, if we can keep improving on the existing financial infrastructure and keep having our financial companies innovate, then there's not going to be that much room for China to come in and say we have something that's much better on a technological case, which then allows people to move from the US dollar to it.
Thank you. That's a perfect segue for me to introduce Sebastian. Sebastian is the Paul Volcker Senior Fellow for International Economics at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also most recently the author of The Power Law, Venture Capital in the Making of the New Future, which includes a chapter on China. Now, the book is very interesting because it's not just a history of venture capital, but it's really about the concept of risk. And it's the concept of how do you create a culture of risk and how do you sustain that culture and translate that into innovation. So I think it's very, very important to have Sebastian address the issue of this playbook that you said has actually been introduced to China. It has thrived and has created so many successes. Has the culture been sustained under the current political environment? What is the prospect for the future? And as Martin was saying about top-down regulation, the question is, will China be able to maintain its technological and innovative edge that so many of us fear are overtaking the United States, both short-term and the long-term?
Thanks, Shirley. Well, I think the framing point here is that China's sort of successful internet companies were started to a remarkable degree, I think much more than people realize, by not only U.S. capital, but U.S. sort of risk methods, risk management methods, incentives under risk. And I'll explain what I mean by that. When Alibaba got started, the first investor was sitting right over there, Shirley Lin. And so I know a lot of what I'm about to say from interviewing her here at UVA when I was writing my book, maybe 4 years ago. I came down here and spent a day. But the point is that Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent, Sina, Sohu, NetEase, EachNet, any of the early Chinese internet companies that you want to name received a US investment styled on a kind of Silicon Valley venture model. Shirley was working at Goldman Sachs, not at a US venture shop, but basically the techniques were Silicon Valley venture. And that meant, as I said, not just the capital, but it also meant that the legal structuring was done by Silicon Valley lawyers who showed up and made sure that there was dispute settlement under New York law, that there was a parent company in the Cayman Islands. And the point of all this was that you could do things like issue equity options to early employees of a company like Alibaba. Without equity options, it's impossible for a startup to persuade the best people in the world to come and work for it, right? And so Joe Tsai, who co-invested with Shirley at the beginning, was a Taiwanese-American, Yale-educated, Sullivan and Cromwell graduate, working at an investment shop in Hong Kong. Why did he take a salary cut of from $600,000 a year to $600 a year, right? 3 orders of magnitude. It's because the stock option package from Alibaba was sufficiently attractive to make it work. Why did later on somebody leave Goldman Sachs and go join Tencent after the IPO and later became one of the business leaders, the kind of Joe Tsai of Tencent? Again, it's because the stock option package was sufficiently attractive. There would not have been these stock options to imbue this sort of risk-taking entrepreneurial culture in China had it not been for that structuring I described with the Cayman Islands parents, because there was no stock option, didn't exist in China. When these were first being handed out by bringing them in from offshore, one of the people I interviewed from Matrix, Bo Tsai, said, I had to think about how to translate stock option into Chinese because nobody had the concept. John Wu was hired from being this chief technology officer of Yahoo to come and be the chief technology officer at the much younger company Alibaba, again, because of stock options. He also got more stock options to then hire an entire team who stayed in Northern California doing the tech for Alibaba. So it was a world-class company because it had world-class talent, because it had stock options, right? In China, the onshore stock markets, not stock options, forget that, just normal stocks, had only been created a few years before Alibaba was set up. So even stock was a new concept. Stock options, forget it. So my belief, and I kind of describe this in my book, is that without that influx of the US venture playbook, you wouldn't have seen all these famous Chinese tech companies get off the ground. And so it follows from that if the government flips its ideology and turns on the US venture playbook and essentially imposes a new, more party-controlled model of technology development, one might expect that if the formula for success is being strangled, the output will be less in the future. And I think that's correct, basically, but with a couple of caveats. First is that, you know, any venture market depends on the size of the market. Because most venture investments fail, you depend on the power law working, meaning that 1 or 2 out of 10 of your investments succeeds, and by success, what is meant is better than 10 times the capital you invested to make up for all those losses that are inevitable when you back early stage companies. And so to get a 10x return on your investment, you need a lot of customers to sell to. So the total addressable market, the TAM, is super important, and China is a big enough economy that you have a large TAM. So I don't think that consumer internet or consumer tech is going away in China, partly for that reason. Second thing is that China, of course, has internalized the US venture playbook that I described at the beginning. It now fully understands how to do this. You don't need foreign investors to be involved anymore. Sequoia China, the sister company of Sequoia US, is the top. So, you know, Sequoia US is the top player in venture capital in Silicon Valley. Sequoia China is the top player in venture capital in China. It's the same company in terms of the history, but it operates basically separately today because, you know, for geopolitical reasons, and because the China operation from Sequoia just doesn't need any more input from the American one. They've learned how to do it. The entrepreneur ecosystem is strong enough. And there is path dependency built into these ecosystems. Once you've got a lot of technology companies that succeed, that trains the people who work inside those companies to understand how entrepreneurship works. They, you know, once the company does well, is mature, they may leave, set up new companies, so you get these genealogies of sort of the offspring of one successful tech company, you know, begetting lots of others. So I think the momentum in the China tech ecosystem will continue for the moment, but for some reason, for various reasons, I think it's going to peter out. One is that when the government tells you what you can invest in as a technology investor, you're closing off the adjacent possibility. And this is a very sort of important source of success in venture capital. You go in as an investor, you back a company, which might be, let's say, the artificial intelligence that the government is very keen on. You go on the board of this company, and while you're on the board of the company, you understand that a further bottleneck in making this technology work is that something else needs to be created. So then you look for another entrepreneur to back who is going to fill that adjacent possibility. But if the delineation of what is government sort of blessed is quite narrow, but then also a little bit blurry, you don't know if that adjacent thing is going to get the government's blessing or not. So you're probably going to think 2 or 3 times before going into that. So I think closing off adjacent possibilities is a bad thing for China's tech future. And in addition, you know, one of the reasons I'm bullish about technology investing globally is that you get this sort of, you know, positive momentum. In Europe, you get Spotify. Spotify means there are 50 to 100 people who have been inside a company from the beginning that scaled to the point where it's worth, you know, $30, $40 billion, whatever the latest number is. And that is the most exciting thing ever in business. And so the people who experience that, some of them are going to split off, start up new startups, or they're going to become venture capitalists, helping other people to do that. And so these role model effects and these momentum effects are very important in building tech ecosystems. How would you create a reverse example effect? You would make Jack Ma disappear. You would make a tech tycoon disappear. You would send a signal to the next generation of potential entrepreneurs, not that this is something you can do and why not be Jack Ma as well. You would send a signal, don't do this because you might end up being Jack Ma, and you don't want to be like that because, you know, it's dangerous for your health. So I think that signal means that whilst on the surface you've got investors like Kai-Fu Lee or Neil Shen, the sort of prominent technology investors in China, who ain't going anywhere because they've got illiquid startup positions that they're locked into, and so they kind of have to play ball with the system. What are they telling their kids to do? They're telling them to go to college in the US and to think about building their career somewhere else. And so I think long term, the Chinese tech ecosystem is going to suffer and pay a price, even though that won't show up in the immediate term.
Thank you. We'll come back to basically talent and ingredients for innovation in a bit. It's great to now come to Anna. Anna Ashton is Director of China Corporate Affairs at the Eurasia Group. She's had a very, despite how young she looks, she's had a very long career in different parts of the U.S. China relationship. She was at the U.S. China Business Council. She was also an intelligence officer for the Department of Defense. And she also worked for her home state of Arkansas, attracting Asian foreign direct investment. So with all of that and all of the things you've been writing about, Anna, I think we've switched from China to the concept of risk to now, what do we do in the United States? And the Biden administration strategy, of course, is to invest at home and to extend its cooperation with allies abroad. Investing at home means to have more competitiveness, innovation, resilience, and democracy. How are we doing on doing what China actually does so well, industrial policy? And can you also tell us a little bit about perhaps the reaction of our allies, whether it's export control or Inflation Reduction Act as a whole? How do you assess our response?
Sure. So one of the interesting things about your comments just now is that, of course, the U.S. is in the midst of embracing its own industrial policy to try to pursue tech competitiveness vis-a-vis China. And that really, it has long roots, but I would say that you could draw a line of demarcation with the 2016 election as both parties were starting to rethink the China relationship. And really, we've moved to a relationship where national security has primacy in terms of considerations and policy promulgation, and the commercial relationship is taking a back seat. That's hard for some people to believe because the commercial relationship is actually still quite robust, but in reality, we have a litany of restrictions and impediments to commerce being erected all the time, and they're mostly tech-related, and almost entirely tech-related, and ostensibly focused on sensitive technologies that get to the core of our national security and national competitiveness. But we're also living in a technological age where virtually everything is arguably tech-related. So the creep of this kind of regulation has the potential to be quite extensive. All of this is being done in the name of rising to the China challenge. So trying to ensure that the U.S. can continue to compete with China, and it has both defensive and offensive elements. The industrial policy is part of the offensive elements, and then the defensive elements are things like export controls, which are designed to prevent China from acquiring some of our leading technology, such as our cutting-edge semiconductor chip designs, and that is essentially an effort to contain China's own technological advancement so that the U.S. can get its act together and be able to run this race more effectively. There's a lot of talk about there being a bipartisan consensus in Washington around all of this, and to some extent that's true. Especially when you think about China policy as compared to other policy issues. Definitely, there is more consensus between Republicans and Democrats on China than there is on pretty much anything else. But that doesn't mean that there's actually as much consensus as meets the eye, and it doesn't diminish the fact that there is deep, intense competition between the two parties. And so even where they agree on China can still be leveraged as a competitive tool for partisan politics. And we see that all the time. So for example, there used to be a handful of legislators that were really engaged on China issues, and there might be a few dozen bills and resolutions proposed in any given Congress that had a China focus, and they were kind of the same old issues every year, like China's manipulation of its currency should be a countervailable subsidy. Now there are hundreds and hundreds of bills and resolutions that are China-focused every Congress. well over 500 in the last Congress, almost 600. And they span the gamut of every topic you can imagine. And it's hard to differentiate between them in terms of how they affect U.S. interests and where they're national security focused versus commercially focused. It's everything from human rights to data privacy. And in that situation, we have both parties trying to position themselves as the better one to lead the U.S. in rising to the China challenge. And then we also have, within the parties, individual politicians trying to compete with each other to position themselves as the better leader to rise to the China challenge. And so it's sort of driving this policy trend of ever more hawkish China rhetoric and ever more restrictive regulations when it comes to the ways that the US and China can interact technologically and in tech commerce. And so where does that leave us? Well, on the defensive side and on the offensive side, one of the big concerns that I have from watching the relationship evolve is that because there is partisan politics driving a lot of this, because China is being invoked really as a tool for addressing lots of domestic issues, not necessarily primarily for addressing China-related issues, but because it is so salient as something that can bring parties together, we have a rush, like a race, to promulgate these policies in the name of making the U.S. more competitive and in the name of ensuring U.S. national security, but without really necessarily fully thinking through the spillover effects and consequences of some of these policies. And so, for example, in the defensive space, we've got export controls meant to prevent China from accessing U.S. high-tech, leading-edge chip design. But those same companies that are responsible for the U.S. having that leading-edge chip design, many of them derive the majority of their global revenue from the business they do in China. So if China can't buy their chips, they have a massive reduction in global revenue, which in turn diminishes their ability to reinvest in their own research and development and stay on the cutting edge. We have things like the decision to try to go after Chinese companies listed on U.S. exchanges for a variety of reasons that are important. There should be the same transparency between all companies that are listed on U.S. exchanges so that U.S. investors have equal certainty when they're investing in any company that's listed. And so there are legitimate reasons why those policies were pushed, but the clauses that would delist all Chinese companies from U.S. exchanges if they aren't fully in compliance with SEC regulations, that the issue being that they can't necessarily fully comply because of China's national security laws, those in the end might not hurt Chinese companies, Chinese tech companies among them, nearly as much as they hurt U.S. investors, because the tech companies can buy back their stocks on the cheap and then go and list somewhere else. And similarly, we have outbound investment restrictions being promulgated that the Biden administration is set to roll out next month, although next month could be the next month. We've been hearing next month for a while now. But those outbound investment restrictions, what we're hearing in DC is that they are initially going to be very narrowly tailored, and that most of this is going to be about monitoring where U.S. outbound investment is going, what sectors of the Chinese economy, how much. The restrictions and the prohibitions will be around things like generative AI, things like semiconductor chips, and we'll focus on non-passive investments, like venture capital. But there is a good chance that that is going to be expanded because the first year is going to be a trial year, and after the trial year, well, first of all, I can assure you that there will be real political outrage over whatever isn't restricted in this executive order. So there will be a lot of pressure to expand it, and Well, maybe I'll stop there, but
Thank you.
lots of other stuff to discuss.
Well, we're going to come back to you again right now, Anna, to start with you, and then maybe Martin and Sebastian. I'm going to ask a short answer question about semiconductor, because our panelists shared with me at dinner what they thought about it, and I think it would take 2 hours for us to get to the start of it. So instead of asking, what do you think about export control, I'm going to ask a very pointed question, because the purpose, of course, of our policy is something that has long been there. Export policy on machinery to produce the most advanced chips has always been there, and China has always been more than 2 generations behind. So the export policy we have now is meant to really hurt the most important and dual-use technology, if you will. Can I ask you, Anna, in your judgment, in how many years will the Chinese be able to make the most advanced chips? And right now, that's 2 nanometer TSMC. In how many years will the U.S. be able to make the most advanced chips? And could you, Martin, say something about that? And then I'll go to Sebastian. So just 2 simple answers there.
So I'll start by saying that the challenges that China and the U.S. face in trying to get to the point where they can each domestically make the most advanced chips are different. China doesn't have the technology, but doesn't have the facilities, does have the labor force, does have enormous ability to funnel state capital into this endeavor, far beyond what the United States could ever get both parties to agree to. The U.S. doesn't have the industrial policy wherewithal. I don't think any democratic system probably is going to ever be able to leverage capital and drive it via the state's direction the way that a non-democratic country like China can.
China 1, U.S. 0.
Yeah, but the U.S. has cornered the market on the most advanced technology, the designs for the most advanced chips,
Yes.
and that's the result of decades of U.S.-led advancements, and those are not easy to replicate.
Actually, maybe I'll go to Sebastian, because his book, first half of it, is all about the history of semiconductor.
I would say US 1, China 0. I would put it the other way around. The reason is that, I think the question is, in a way, access to these most advanced chips as much as making them yourself. So at the moment, the US produces the designs and kind of produces the lithography, in the sense that ASML, the Dutch firm that dominates lithography for etching the chips, has major operations in the US, and therefore will do what the US government says. So I think it's got those advantages, and it will have trouble making 2 nanometer chips, of course, because Taiwan's not going to let that leave Taiwan. But at least it has access to them, whereas China doesn't.
I would say to answer, I guess I'm the tiebreaker, and I'll
1-1
go
right now.
I'll go on Sebastian's side, but kind of say that China is going to take at least 10 to 15 years, and it could be just never, because this is not a static finish line. It continues to go, and it's also an incredibly globalized market. So Sebastian mentioned ASML, the Dutch company. The lasers that they use are only created by Cymer, which is in San Diego, puts it under U.S. export control laws if they want to. Tokyo Electron is the other major company, and they use a lot of U.S. technology as well. Those are 2 of the top 5 semiconductor equipment manufacturing companies. The other 3 are all American companies, Lam, KLA, and Applied Materials. So the U.S. has an incredible choke point in this area. I am worried about them overuse of these controls, leading the American companies' technology and software to get designed out. That's what I'm most worried about. And that has already happened in some areas of the chip design process. So at the end of the process, the testing, making sure the chips are actually working, that's equipment where the US was competitive, and now they're all designed out. Because if you use a little bit of US technology, it's now tainted, and you can use those controls. And so if you're thinking about the US, the desire to move faster and make China go slower Actually, the administration, I think, thinks there's a complementarity there, but I actually see a trade-off. The more that building in the US means you can't sell to the Chinese market, the less the TAM, the total addressable market, is for your technology. So then the US is subsidizing you on the one hand, but they're restricting your market on the other, and that makes the US less attractive as a place to build and design the tech.
Thank you. So that's a tie. Yes.
I was just going to add, particularly because the U.S. subsidies are not equal to the market profits that they are cutting off. Right. Not even close.
So I guess that's a tie. So let me ask another question on this competition to keep the scorecard going. Sanctions. So I'll start with Martin, who writes extensively about, of course, China's effort to diminish the importance of US dollar as a reserve currency. So do you think sanctions can be effective in the long term? How are the Chinese thinking about it? And I will extend the same question we were talking about yesterday, the implication for public policy in terms of the effectiveness of using weaponizing US dollar. I would just go down in this order.
So China has been very concerned, especially since the sanctions on Iran, about US dollar sanctions, because so much of their trade and their financial activity goes to the US dollar. I hope that the US understands that this is mutually assured destruction, in the sense that if you put major sanctions on a top PRC financial institution, it will cause immense damage to the global financial system. Won't necessarily result in a move from the US dollar, because what are you going to move to? All of the major reserve currencies in the world joined on the Russia sanctions. So that's an interesting example where Russia's attempt to move out of USD into euros and yen and pounds did literally zero for their ability to get around sanctions. With China, the interesting question is, would you have the same level of consensus in the international community on, say, an invasion of Taiwan as you have with a Russian invasion of Ukraine? And I think the answer is definitely not. So to them, they're still thinking that there's some diversification, and they have benefit to diversification. They have been moving away a little bit. But the US dollar is just so well entrenched that it would take something like, I think, a Taiwan invasion and an imposition of heavily damaging sanctions that would get enough countries to say, if I use the US dollar, I can't transact with China. And I really need that for the future of my development. I need access to Chinese capital. I need access to the Chinese market. Therefore, I need to have a robust system that is outside the US sanctions net. Barring that, I don't see it happening.
So Martin is highly confident. Okay, Anna.
Yeah, I mean, the efforts to move away from reliance on the US dollar, there have been some splashy headlines, definitely. I mean, most recently, I think it was Brazilian President Lula visiting China and talking about all of their trade, their bilateral trade, being denominated in their own currencies, and actually the BRICS as a group, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are also working on denominating trade in something other than the dollar. And that's happening between China and Russia. There are agreements like that in the works between China and Saudi Arabia. But we're still talking about a fraction of the world's transactions. The dollar definitely has extreme dominance for the time being. And it's going to take a long time for that to change, especially with China being a closed capital account. It makes it hard for China to be the currency for for all trade transactions.
So two. No,
okay.
one. No, I mean 2-0 now.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. So I think Martin began his presentation at the beginning by saying there's a network effect that favors the dollar. I think it's like the English language. You know, it's used globally, and people learn English because other people speak English, and it's the same with the dollar, and it's extremely hard to break that. And if you think about some of these headlines that sort of excitedly portend a crack in this dollar dominance, let's just take the one about, the Saudis and the Chinese have done a deal where the Chinese will, buy the oil, and the Saudis will accept payment in renminbi instead of dollars. So what? I mean, what are the Saudis going to do with the renminbi they receive? they're going to switch them into dollars because they don't want to hold renminbi in their accounts. Nobody wants renminbi in their accounts. It's not a, there are capital controls, all kinds of financial repression going on in China. You don't want to hold renminbi. So it makes no difference, these headlines. And one of the most amazing, I think examples of sort of, I am a journalist, but, sort of kind of lack of understanding in this debate is that every time Lula opens his mouth and says some random thing, the last time I checked, he's not a great economist. And it's just kind of mostly irrelevant most of the time, to be honest. I mean, I think there are serious issues in an extreme scenario where, there was a Taiwan full-on war. Okay, fine. I think we'd have other things to worry about than dollar dominance if that happened, frankly. But short of that, I just don't see the dollar dominance changing.
All right, that was 3 for nothing. So that's a reassuring panel. I would like all of you to now continue with the questions and answers. And just like the first panel, if you have cards, I'm going to leave the panelists with something to think about while you're sending those cards over. At the end of the panel, in about 18 minutes, I'd like to ask you the question. So even 18 months before export control happened and before TikTok was ever hauled in as a discussion point, nobody could have predicted, nobody. And so if you look at all the forecasting, and of course all 3 of you do quite a bit of forecasting, and so what would you say at the end of this panel, and I'll come back to that to end the panel, as the most likely unexpected next move by either government? And I say this is really pretty surprising. For example, sanctions have been applied to Hong Kong leaders. And so the fact that the top leaders in Hong Kong actually do not have credit cards, walk around in cash, something you could not have ever imagined, but that is the reality. So yes, I'll leave that as a magic question for the end. Can I have the index cards of questions? Yes. This will take us a few days. Yeah. Okay. Okay, a positive question that will get a positive energy. In these terrible, I think it wrote 10 times, I translate it as terrible. Is there a role for mutual interdependence between U.S. and China? If so, where could it be most effectively utilized so that we would have a beneficial cycle? I think that's a great one. We were talking about talent. We're at University of Virginia, where we are very international. Why don't we start from Sebastian, who's been writing about this?
I think there's one simple thing that Biden administration could do, which would signal that kind of Yellen was serious about what she said yesterday, and that is get rid of the Trump tariffs. I mean, the Trump tariffs have zero to do with national security. They're just dumb. And you should get rid of them. And that would signal that you're willing to trade with China, but you're not willing to do stuff which is military dual use. And it would, I think it would support the US sort of emerging position, which is we're not trying to do China down. When Yellen says that, and it appears to apply to semiconductors, it's obviously untrue, right? She is trying to do China down when it comes to semiconductor development and AI development. So it's just not credible to say it and then leave it hanging as though this applies to generally US policy, because some part of US policy is about suppressing China's progress. And it should be because it's military. But there are other stuff about non-military interactions where we should be keen to interact. And I think a first step is to get rid of the Trump tariffs.
Anna, Martin?
So we remain quite interdependent. And it's going to be a long road to untangle that without there being horrible fallout. But it's kind of weaponized interdependence at this point. And when Eurasia Group looks at the trajectory for the U.S. China relationship, our base case for the remainder of 2023 is a 50% chance that the U.S. and China continue on this trajectory of controlled deterioration in the relationship, but a 40% chance that one of a litany of different flashpoints could trigger a more precipitous destruction of U.S.-China ties. And we really it's like a 10% chance that there is a possibility of the relationship getting substantially better in the near term. And I would call it more like a 0% chance. I think that the best path forward in terms of getting back to some form of constructive, cooperative relationship actually has little to do with the United States and China directly right now, and more to do with Europe, and whether or not Europe can continue to court China as a semi-constructive party in the Russia-Ukraine conflict and as a commercial partner, and whether or not China can continue to court Europe as in both of those same ways, such that Europe doesn't come completely over to the US side and become even more adversarial towards China, which, despite the fact that it's nice to have allies and partners, I don't think we really want to see in the macro sense, because it would create all sorts of incentives for China to do much more aggressive things.
So I'll give two examples of positive cooperation that I think are a potential roadmap for future ones. One is the audit deal that Anna mentioned earlier, where the US and China were able to come to a compromise and not delist all of the Chinese companies on US exchanges, because China recognized the US was no longer just going to allow China to blatantly flout the US rules on audit supervision, especially after all of the scandals, and they figured out a deal. And the deal seems to be working quite well. So that's great. There are ways for technocratic agreements that can bridge two seemingly incompatible legal regimes. Another one is end-use checks, where the US was going to say, we're going to put these companies on the unverified list in China, where we can't verify if we send them a machine, did they just transship it right to the PLA, or are they actually using it to produce consumer goods? And they threatened all these companies with it, and what happened? Suddenly China opened up the roadblocks and allowed the U.S. Commerce Department to do these end-use checks. So you see that both of these times the U.S. had to wield a stick and say, no, we're not going to stand for this anymore, but then China compromised. And it wasn't the kind of compromise where it's a capitulation and we've destroyed these companies. It's one where we're actually able to work together. So I think if we can keep finding ways like this, and if these deals continue to work operationally, that can help improve trust. And I'll just, on a more macro level, I think the whole idea that we're going to decouple from China, I've always found ridiculous as a straw man. That you're essentially saying there will be no connections between the world's two largest economies. Even the Soviet Union was not fully decoupled in this way from the United States. So what you're really talking about is how can you manage the interdependence? And we're dialing it back in some areas, and I think that's pretty normal as we figure out how core these are to security. And it's just about figuring out, can there be some sort of stable guardrail that we get to where we say, this is national security and this is not? And that's what Yellen was referring to. For now, we're still negotiating that. But I think I can imagine a world in a few years in which we have a little bit more stable answers to these questions of which technologies are in and out of bounds, and that could be a positive step.
Thank you. Maybe we should talk about other players who could be important in this, and I'll come to, so we have great questions for all three of them. I'm going to ask them in turn. So if you can make all the answers short, we'll get through, everybody can take all the questions. So for Anna, should countries such as India, which is concerned about its own strategic autonomy, consider banning Twitter and Facebook, and what are the implications of that for the United States?
I'm told, although I don't have a ton of direct experience because I'm too old to be really versatile as a user of TikTok, but, well, maybe not too old, too lame. But I'm told by my teenagers that Instagram and Facebook suck and Twitter is stupid. But, India's already banned TikTok, so that's all they're left with. And I suppose they could come up with their own homegrown app, and that wouldn't be a bad idea. But in terms of maintaining strategic autonomy, I think India's got other things beyond social media apps that weigh heavily for them. And I think that that's going to continue to be the case. India, we've reframed our relationships with Asia to call this the Indo-Pacific for a reason. We think of India as a democracy, and therefore, and this gigantic democracy that just surpassed China in terms of its population, and therefore our best potential ally in confronting China. And we know that India and China, there's not a lot of love lost between them. But India also has a long history of maintaining strategic autonomy, even when it's really important to the United States, and it's doing so right now with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So I don't think that we should expect that to change.
Thank you. Sebastian, this one definitely is for you. How might the saying, Chinese learning as essence, Western learning as application, 中体西用, which is commonly said in Chinese, help us understand China's business and financial infrastructure and policy? And second, so after all that the three of you said, so China has the money, they have the people, they have the land, they can subsidize everything. What is preventing them from making the most advanced chips? That one, a short answer.
So I'm a bit stumped by the first one, but the second one, I'll try the second one. That's the good thing about getting two questions. Look, there are lots of examples of geographies that appear to have the ingredients for innovation and fail to innovate. So take Europe until 10 years ago, or 5 years ago even. There are more software engineers, believe it or not, in the European Union than there are in the United States. There's a bigger market in the European Union than in the United States. How many famous technology startups are there in Europe? Well, there's Spotify, and I'm going to name a couple of others. But basically, the US has cleaned Europe's clock, and the only sort of significant, really top-tier tech company is probably SAP, the German software company, but it's not a new one, it's as old as Microsoft or something. So it's amazing how you can have the sort of inputs for tech and innovation and not actually get any outputs. And so I think one should look to the sort of chemistry that creates the outputs, and I argue that basically it's about the kind of risk capital that makes the extraordinarily difficult thing of starting a new company and trying a new technology or just trying something new. You need risk capital that underwrites that and reduces the otherwise unbearable risk. Doesn't eliminate it, but reduces it. And in the case of sort of new technology experiments, that's basically venture capital. And if China does something to damage the ecosystem, as I said earlier, that's going to be bad. And if you are talking about very capital-intensive projects like semiconductor fabs, that's not for VC because they don't do big enough checks to make that possible. But you do need sort of the right elements in place. And I think the thing about semiconductors is kind of sui generis. It's just, Taiwan has accumulated this edge by relentlessly investing in the talent and building the experience from one generation of chips to the next. And so I think that's the problem of catch-up there is kind of like the catch-up problem in Europe or the US for specifically manufacture of chips. But but there's a wider thing about the infrastructure or the chemistry of risk-taking, which I think China is losing because of its authoritarian crackdown.
Thank you, Sebastian. Two questions for Martin. So what do you think of the consensus being built as China shows more hostility and stands more closely with Russia? And I think this very much relates to also its financial architecture as it works more closely with Russia. There are a lot of concerns about the digital yuan, supposedly that is challenging the US dollar supremacy. Where do digital assets, crypto, play in the U.S. China global financial ecosystem?
These are two great questions. So on the Russia side, I think the most important takeaway is that the no limits partnership is baloney. That if you look at Chinese exports to Russia in the immediate aftermath of the invasion, they collapsed. Now they've come back. but there's so far not been any evidence of any lethal aid to Russia. They're not sending tanks. They're not sending ammunition. I mean, they're like minuscule amounts that we're seeing of some rifles and body armor and things, but that's very small compared to the size of China. You think of the millions, tens of millions of private companies in China, all of which could make something by reselling. And you've seen just it's the dog that didn't bark. You haven't seen very much of it. They also haven't bailed them out financially. In a sense, what China's done is buy a lot of oil from Russia, but that allows the Europeans to keep their hands clean and not import that oil, but also not have oil prices go up and get them all voted out of office. So in a sense, China's doing exactly what it's supposed to do under the way that these things have been organized. We hope that it continues this way because of the risk, and the Europeans and others have made this clear. In the financial sense, right away when Visa and MasterCards were taken out of China, taken out of Russia in the wake of the sanctions, there was a big rush for Russians to open up UnionPay cards. And UnionPay said, we don't want to touch that. We're terrified of U.S. sanctions. So the really interesting thing is China's really tried to continue its regular commercial relations with Russia without tripping sanctions or export controls. And they've done a very good job of it so far, if you think about it. And then in the crypto, there's this now in Washington, anytime somebody wants loose regulation on something, they say, if you regulate this too hard, then China's going to eat our lunch on it. And that's something that Libra did, Facebook has done, and now the crypto community does. And they say, China's going to beat us in the crypto race if we overregulate crypto. And my argument is, China's not in the race. China has banned all cryptocurrency. They've banned mining. They've used the Great Firewall to block access even to overseas exchanges. They don't want to be in this race. So whatever the US does is going to be more than what China does. And their central bank digital currency doesn't even use blockchain. They said blockchain isn't useful for us. It can't handle the scale of transactions that we need. So I'm not worried about that at all.
Well, thank you. This is a very strong panel with strong opinions, and I'm glad to that. So to come to forecasting, maybe we could start with Sebastian. What do you think is the most unlikely but potentially important regulation that is to come?
Banning TikTok. I say that because I think that AI is going to transform the sort of landscape of information. And the distinction between kind of good information, like the Wall Street Journal website in Chinese, and junk information is going to become more and more apparent as junk information is so prevalent. And the traditional sort of liberal view that the way you deal with junk education is that you educate people. I was taught and reminded recently when I went to Monticello a couple of days ago that one of Jefferson's 3 pillars was, public education, what he believed in freedom of religion, freedom of political thought, and thirdly, public education. Education is just naive to think that you can equip citizens to resist junk information through education. We've run that experiment with Facebook, for goodness sake, and AI is going to be multiple times more deceptive. And so we're just going to have to realize that sort of a First Amendment that's more than 200 years old needs to be updated to deal with AI. And TikTok, and therefore the sort of reluctance, the First Amendment reluctance to mess with TikTok, I think will fall away, and the imperative of protecting the US from that, cognitive environment that is manipulative, which Taiwan knows about much more intimately, will become clearer.
Thank you. Anna.
Well, I think TikTok will get banned, and I think it's going to be funny to see how that goes, because the chasm in terms of technological wherewithal and savviness between the people banning TikTok and the people who use it is pretty wide. The last time that they talked about banning TikTok, before I even had heard about it, during the Trump administration. I came home and my kids had already like changed their locations to Nigeria on their phones. So, and they're pretty representative, I think. But yeah, I'm going to steal another thing that Sebastian said, which is removing tariffs. I don't think it's going to happen in the U.S. under the Biden administration, and maybe not under a subsequent administration, Republican or Democrat, because of the pressure of the labor vote, which is really the swing vote in this country right now. But I do think it is the thing that it would be easiest for the U.S. to do and most impactful in terms of a symbol of goodwill. But again, I don't think it's going to happen. What I do see happening is China on a bit of a charm offensive in terms of its trade relations with other countries, including our allies and partners. So for instance, we saw China resolve its dispute with Australia over barley, and they've dropped their restrictions and started to improve their trade relations with Australia, which is a good idea when Australia is talking about buying nuclear submarines from the United States, right? I think that we'll see a lot more of that from China.
Thank you.
I would say the unexpected move could be Chinese retaliation on the tech side, because that is another dog that has not barked. You see with the tariffs, when the US put the tariffs on, China put a tariff on approximately the same quantity of goods. US puts out semiconductor controls, nothing. US puts Chinese firms on the entity list, nothing. Or says, we will put American firms on the unreliable entity list, not a thing so far. Just other than defense contractors who are not dealing with China at all. But just lately, we started to see this cybersecurity review of Micron. I am very concerned that they will suddenly start actually retaliating because they might just get fed up with the US. And that would actually lead to real decoupling. China hasn't wanted it. They recognize that retaliation would deteriorate the Chinese business environment and hurt them probably more. But we might still go down that route.
Well, thank you very much for that unpredictable future, and thank you for being here.